Hi, this is Uncle Matt's D&D Studio. I'm Matt Finch, and this is the second of two conversations with Tim Brannan. This one focuses a little bit more on adventure design. The first one focused a little bit more on old school style 5th edition play. So let's move on to adventure design with Tim Brannan. And please, again, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're interested in topics like that. Let's move on. Okay, and we are live. I'm back with Tim Brannan. We're going to be talking a little bit more, we're going to be talking this time more about adventure design. Our last video that we did was sort of focused on 5th edition and the interaction with old school, and so this one's going to sort of be an agglomeration of those two, because I imagine we're going to be talking about writing adventures for both Swords and Wizardry original D&D and then also 5th edition, and how those two can overlap with the adventure design. So first question, did you like in the 90s or in the 80s do the same thing that I did, which was even when you were writing an adventure for your regular sitting at the living room sort of playing, did you still make it look like a module?
Yeah, actually I did. So I have this one, probably it's not one of the first adventures I ever wrote, but it was one of the first ones I remember writing on the new word processing software that I had bought, overtly for my college program. And instead of working on papers, I wrote an adventure. So I ended up writing what I called the sequel to Ravenloft. I called it Ravenloft 3 Necropolis. And of course, I made it look as much like I could make the module look, given it was late 80s technology.
Yeah, I did exactly the same
on my
thing.
old Tandy Color Computer 3.
The reason I ask is that that seems to be a really common or a point that seems to be an almost universal point of commonality in between people who are who have published modules for money, is that we all seem to have done that.
Yeah, and if you even go back and look at the ones I did on my own for the Buffy the Vampire Slayer game, they all look like old modules. So, black background, picture in there, text on the bottom. So yeah, I guess some habits die really, really hard.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay, now let's begin with where we started on this in the first video, and that was just the question of how much time we spend on it. My estimate was that I spent about 80 hours on a module. Yours was that it was probably about 50 hours on a module. Let's talk about,
50 to 60, yeah.
50 to 60. Okay, so with that time range, let's talk about starting points. Just where is it that you tend to begin when you're working on something like that?
So thinking about I have an adventure that's going to be published for another system for a different company that I can't mention yet. I'm still NDA'd on it, but I'm hoping it's going to be good. So we'll wait and see. For that, it started out as a basic idea that I tossed out, and it began with an idea of a bunch of kids, very children of the village of the dam, children of the dam sort of thing. We're going around and causing all this bad weather. And I originally referred to the adventure as Indigo is the New Black. And, talking about the eye color of the kids. And I thought with that as the genesis, and maybe this is a very lame way to write adventures, I came up with my hook first, and then I built the adventure around it. So weird psychic kids causing bad weather. All right, what do we do? Well, what is the investment of the players? Why do they want to do this? What do the characters get out of it? Why is it happening? So with that, I then went into outline mode, started figuring out, and I try to follow a basic sort of 3-act situation. If it's good enough for the bard, it's good enough for me. And figure out, okay, so what is the beginning? What's the setup? What's going on? What's the mystery? And where do we need to be at the end? And I'll sort of start filling in the blanks after that. Michelangelo also said he saw the sculpture in the marble. He just chipped away all the pieces that didn't look like it. So I just start chipping away all the pieces that are not necessarily part of this adventure. So I end up usually with two files. One is a giant outline with lots of random ideas shoved in it, and then I start taking that and building sort of the adventure document from
So
that.
that's a really interesting technique that I haven't heard a lot of people really use. So I mean, you sort of start out with actual, call it brainstorming in that initial outline, and then
Right.
what you do is pare down instead of adding.
Right. I mean, obviously, I'm going to need to add some things because when I get out of that first draft, I realize I'm probably half the size I need to be. So if I'm aiming for 8,000 words, I'm probably only at 5,000 at that point. And I have to start thinking, all right, so what else is going on? And I try to think of, well, what were the adventures I enjoyed most as a kid? Which ones were the ones I enjoyed running? Which were the ones I enjoyed playing? And I'll go back to Ravenloft in this. There's a great mystery going on in Ravenloft. What's happening? What's going on? But there's also other things going. Oh my God, this place is full of undead who want to kill me. So what is it that wants to kill who wants to stop the players, or excuse me, who wants to stop the characters from doing
Let's
what
jump
they need
over
to do?
before you finish my first question.
Yeah.
Let's jump over. You talked about looking back at modules that you had enjoyed playing and that are an influence. What are some of those modules in addition to Ravenloft?
All right, so Ravenloft was one of my favorites. Another one was I love the original B1 Search of the Unknown simply because it was so wide open, and it didn't have a very tangible story attached to it as opposed to say Ravenloft, and that allowed me to sort of imprint my own ideas on it. And I've run this module probably a dozen times or so, each time slightly different. Loved Palace of the Silver Princess, the green version. I wasn't fortunate enough to buy an orange version.
Very, very few people were.
Yeah, no, I know. And the deal with that is I mean, I'm kind of odd in that respect of an old school player. And I do like the narrative. I do like the story. I like characters to develop and become heroes in that respect. And I like sort of a cohesive narrative happening for everything.
No, I certainly, just as an aside, I certainly don't believe that there is any monolithic set of requirements on an old school thing. I think that, you can get called old school, but you've got, sort of a mosaic of, this aspect of old school gaming, that aspect of old school gaming. So when people say, I do a thing that's not necessarily old school, I guess that, that sort of does apply, but I don't see that as being any sort of criticism. I mean, old school is more of an overall method than it is an aspirational goal.
Right.
Okay, so those are the adventures that are historically important: B1, B3, and Ravenloft being three of the main ones. And that's interesting because two of them have a heavy narrative and one of them has none at all.
Yeah, exactly. And I did enjoy the Palace of the Vampire Queen, one of the very, very first adventures to ever be published. Also, absolutely no narrative going on in that one. So either I am a fan of no narrative, or I'm a fan of narrative, or I'm a fan of horror, because most of those have a horror element involved with them as well.
Or at least a very heavy sense of something went wrong, like in B1. You're going through an area where clearly, stuff has gone wrong.
Right. And B3 is essentially a chill or Call of Cthulhu adventure gone very sideways. Somebody summoned something, and now you've got this ancient evil entity that's trapped everything. I mean, it's practically an episode of Supernatural. So
yeah, I can see.
Or X-Files.
What was it when we diverged? When you were talking, I diverged us over into the favorite modules. You were talking about methodology on the thing and paring down. So take it from there.
So I start with a bunch of ideas. I start with a bunch of things that I think can possibly be happening. I like to think when I'm either running a game or I'm playing, I like to think that the characters do not exist in a vacuum. So, yeah, there's a spot that they are on the map, but there's other things going on. All right, what are those other things, and how can they affect what's happening to the characters? Because while they don't exist in a vacuum, they are the stars. I mean, when I read Sherlock Holmes, I want to read about Sherlock and Watson. I don't want to read about, you know, the uh, the cab driver that comes and gets them and takes them on where they're needing to go. That guy's important, but he's only important in as far as the plot, and I need to make sure that he's there somewhere. So, what else is happening in this world? What else is happening in this dungeon? What else is happening in this abandoned castle that could potentially affect what's happening to the players? So I'll put that in, and then I just sort of try to
Now, let me
assemble all
ask.
the
Hang on. Let me
pieces.
break in. Let me break in
Sure.
there because when you talk about things that can um, affect what the characters are doing, there's a couple of different approaches that people take with that. And so, just to sort of nail down what you're talking about, do you tend to have? I mean, every adventure, every good adventure. Has a backstory, not necessarily the characters, but there is a backstory to what's happening in
Right.
the adventure, even if it's one that has zero plot, like B1. Because even in B1, there's the issue of Rogan and Zeligar, went off to fight barbarians and may come back, and the
Right.
whole bit there. But so these backstories, do you? Generally, I tend to have a static backstory. There's a thing that happened. It may affect what the characters do, but in the main, there's only one um, thread, and they're almost guaranteed to run into it. And there are not variable possible outcomes, except for
Right.
when I use like a monster roster that they may
Yeah.
kill, a certain number, and eventually they will run out rather than having infinite monsters. Do you follow that sort of single backstory effect, or do you have multiple possible outcomes based on what it is that they do? It's a matter of degree, I think, but
Uh, yeah, I tend to probably focus on the one backstory, to be honest with you. There's something happening, and that is a sort of universal fact in the game. How they discover this universal fact can vary. Probably a good example would be the last time I ran Keep on the Borderlands, B2. And everybody has run Keep on the Borderlands multiple times. We all know it. It's great. It's fun. We love it. It doesn't make a lot of sense. All of these monsters that would otherwise be at each other's throats, living in what is essentially a condominium for monsters. But we still do it. So I thought, well, okay, what's holding all these factions together? Mutual hatred. They're afraid to kill each other because the minute they attack, somebody will attack them. Well, I threw in this whole cult of chaos that has been controlling, and their whole purpose was to gather up all of these creatures to eventually attack the keep. And I think that's somewhat implied in it, or maybe the years of me running it that particular way has made me believe that it's implied.
I think it kind of is implied there because
Right.
they've got the bad guys both in the keep and at
Right.
the
Well,
cave.
there's that, and there's that the Caves K, which are the nicer, the penthouse of the Caves of Chaos, and those are a little bit nicer. And you've got the human cultists in there, and I even believe in the newer version, the 25th anniversary, they make that a little bit more explicit, which is interesting because I'd been doing that anyway. And now I've just tied them more and more to demonic cults, and that's where my current players are right now, dealing with the after effects of this. When coming up with adventures, I try to think, okay, so what is that, and how can the players uncover it? So I look at it a little bit like what if I look at it sort of mystery like. Is this a Conan Doyle sort of mystery where the only way you're going to figure this out is if you're very, very, very clever and you happen upon all the right clues? Or is this an Agatha Christie mystery where all the clues are right there in front of you? You just have to know how to find them? Or are we talking about a Charles Dickens sort of story where the only way this is going to happen when the most improbable of all events come together and you happen to be right there when it happens? so I try to think, okay, what is the most likely way they're going to uncover these clues? How are they going to know that this is, the Cult of Chaos? Or in my Indigo is the New Black adventure. That's not what it's called, but that's what I've always called it after it's published. How do you know these kids are causing this bad weather, other than the fact that they look weird? Maybe they're just weird. Maybe they're not actually doing anything. If they are doing something, how do you figure that out? Is there somebody else controlling them? Are they doing it themselves? What's happening? So I try to think of it in terms of, what can I believe my players will reasonably discover, and how will they go about discovering it, and then what will they do with that information? And I sort of work backwards from there.
Okay, let me jump in right there, because you've hit on one of the things that I think is a big theme in terms of different approaches to designing adventures. I'm doing a series on adventure design on the channel, and one of the things that and I haven't done this one yet, I don't think, but one of my big points is that pretty much any adventure, in order to be a good adventure, has to have some mystery for the players to discover. And it's great if that gives the players some sort of meaningful advantage in winning the adventure. But frankly, discovering a mystery has value in and of itself. That's almost an additional reward that's different from treasure, and it probably won't affect your character sheet, but it's one of those people, players love that aha moment. And so what you're describing as a method of adventure design is focused toward the idea of the progression of information, rather than a progression through the physical space of a dungeon, which a lot of people will focus on, through a progression of increasingly difficult monsters, through a progression of different tactical situations. What you're doing is you're tracing the information and using that as the spine for the way that you write the adventure.
Right. Yeah, I've run a lot of campaigns over the years, and the ones that I think back on, the ones I really enjoyed playing in, or the ones I really enjoyed running, were the ones where the players had not just agency in terms of what it is they can contribute to the overall story, because they are contributing. I'm not over here making everything up all on my own. I mean, heck, if I built adventures just on my youngest son's paranoid ramblings on what's happening in the adventures, he's not really paranoid. He's just really excited. It might be better than anything I'd come up with all on my own, because he's putting stuff together. I even have a crazy looking conspiracy board over here that he's been putting together on how all these different cults are related in the game. And I'll just, honestly, I'll look over and I'll cheat and I'll be like, yeah, that's how it works. I want the players, and like I said, thinking back to things I've done myself, I want them to have investment in what's happening. There's really no treasure in the DMG that I don't have a character that had or received or found at some point in time. While if I have a first level character and he gets a shiny new +1 sword for the very, very first time, yes, I'm going to be excited. But it's not the first +1 sword I've ever had as a player. What is it that character's doing that's going to keep me as a player coming back? What worked in 79 when I've been playing about a year, and what works in 2017 when I've been playing close to 38 years are two different things now for me. And I want to try to tap into that. And the nice thing about doing the sort of the mystery, like you were discussing, is
hang on, before we get to the mystery. Before we get to the mystery, you've just touched on one of the other things that I talked about.
Sure.
And this one I have done the video on, which is player motivation as being something, and I was talking about it from the standpoint of adventure design, that you need to this is more of structuring it in at the beginning as opposed to how you're doing it later on, but that you really have to make your players have a better attitude, not bad attitude, but that have a different angle of interest into this thing than simply it's this week's adventure, and there's treasure. And I did talk about, and I'll put a link to this in the description of it as well. there are a lot of different ways to motivate players. I mean, you get all the way up to at high level, changing the map itself, having an effect on the world itself, even on something that's written down, or you wrote your name on the dungeon wall and you see it every time, you go by, things like that. And I think the player motivation, is really, really important. And so you've just picked up another one of the themes that I think is, although it's more of an upfront kind of a thing than the development of the mystery, but it's one of the cornerstones of designing there. So having said that, okay, either comment on that or go back to the mystery that you were
No, actually, I can kind of do a little bit of both. So with the mystery part, or we say mystery, but there's a lot of, that falls a fairly broad category of what's going on. That's the hook. That's what gets them into the adventure. That's not what keeps them in the adventure. If the mystery's boring, or uninteresting, or they don't care, they're not going to stick around. I can build a fantastic dungeon or castle or catacomb or whatever, and it won't do me a lick of good if the characters decide to turn left instead of turning right and say, well, I don't want to go there. Let's go to this other place that seems more interesting. I'm like, no, that place isn't even mapped out yet. I don't even know what that is. So you hook them in and you keep them going, and the potential to solve either greater mysteries or make their mark, literally or figuratively, on the world, is what keeps them coming back.
And you did also, you introduced the topic of different types of mysteries, because I think the baseline of those, and probably the one that I do most commonly, is just dead simple. It's not a matter really of clues. It's just a matter of finding out what happened here. Almost every adventure is kicked off by some sort of event. And so mostly it's just sort of as they go through the other stuff, they are building up more knowledge about what it is that happened here, and that provides the sort of there's a mystery, but it's not like they're in a mystery novel. It's simply that it's they're learning more and more about it, and then you get all the way up to, like you were talking about, where if it's the Conan Doyle sort of adventure, where what they're actively doing is looking for clues, knowing that they have to put these together. They're not really going to stumble on them. They're going to need to figure something out from that.
Yeah, and see, I've always preferred that style of play over, say, the one with complicated traps or riddles. That's great. I understand where that's fun, but for me, it's more like, okay, what's happening? Why is it happening? What happens if I don't solve this? What are the consequences? Going back to probably some of the stuff I did for Ghosts of Albion, I worked with the authors of both the novels and the BBC web series that the game's based on. And one of the authors, Amber Benson, was telling me, she goes, every great Ghosts of Albion adventure has to begin with a murder. So taking that sort of in mind, I'm like, all right, somebody's dead. Why? Who killed them? Why did they want them dead? What effects of them being dead are, going on in the rest of the world? And we sort of work out from that point. So that is the universe that those sort of adventures work in. Would I do the same thing for Call of Cthulhu? Probably pretty close. Would I do the same thing for Buffy, which is another horror game slightly removed? Maybe not. Would I do it for D&D 5? It depends on what I'm doing for the adventure, but it's certainly an interesting place to start. With D&D, old school or 5th edition, the one thing I do want to keep in mind is that, there's a lot of pages dedicated in the rule books to combat. So I'm not going to completely make this, a Sherlock Holmes adventures in Waterdeep. It's going to be, there's always going to be the potential of like figuring out who did things and then being able to beat them across the head with some, steel if we have to.
Right. So, hitting a pause here, because I've got sort of an idea, a question brewing,
Okay.
but I'm not sure that I can really nail it down. I mean, what's the difference in your mind between an adventure that's specifically designed for a horror game as opposed to one that is designed for an adventure game like D&D in any of its incarnations?
So, probably the largest area of gaming I do outside of D&D is horror games. And then even then, a large proportion of those are Victorian Gothic horror. So, walking around the streets of London is in 1837 is very different than walking through the streets of Greyhawk. There are some similar things I can do. Take some horror tropes. There's a ghost. There is a maiden, or a gentleman, or somebody who's being kidnapped by an evil lord. I mean, these are some plot ideas that I could do in either one of those games. So I go back to the old maxim, or axiom rather, about what's the difference between a horror film and an adventure film, or excuse me, a horror film and an action adventure film. If the last surviving person is a young woman, then you have a horror film. If the last surviving person is a big burly dude, then you have action adventure. Because what happens at that point, it's how they go up against who's ever left, the bad guy. So if Bruce Willis was in Friday the 13th, that's a very different sort of story than what you have. Or, hell, most of our action adventure guys are still really getting old. I mean, Tom Cruise is getting 60 now, and he's still doing Jack Reacher movies. The point I'm getting at is the difference between an action adventure game or an adventure game like D&D and a horror game is how much power do the characters have. Mm-hmm. Now, if it's the way back in the 3rd edition days, Wizards of the Coast produced this really cool D20 Call of Cthulhu book. And it's pretty awesome. And the layout is just gorgeous. And it captures the feel of Call of Cthulhu pretty well. Does it do it perfectly? No, it doesn't do it perfectly, because I believe that the Chaosium system that Call of Cthulhu has captures it perfectly. But it does a really good job. But there's an interesting little appendix in back, and it says, using Call of Cthulhu in Dungeons and Dragons. And it talks about how in Call of Cthulhu, you have characters who are called investigators. And I think that's an important distinction. They're not heroes. They're not adventurers. They're investigators. They're trying to find out what's going on. And they have some agency in the fact that they know things. But for everybody who's ever played Call of Cthulhu knows, knowing something in the game isn't necessarily the same as being able to do anything about it. And sometimes knowing stuff is actually much worse for you. In D&D, knowing something helps you. And you're expected to, once again, take out your steel and beat whatever monster you're after senseless. A buy key or a my go are terrifying when you're a first level human and all you have is your journal articles, a book, and a walking stick. It's not so terrifying when you've got armor and a sword. So I think the difference largely becomes of how much power do these characters have, and how much power do they have to make changes to what's happening in the world in front of them. Horror, you're not generally expected to be able to make many changes. In D&D, you're expected to make some changes. I fully expect my characters in my 5th edition game to come up against whatever abyssal horror I plan on throwing at them and defeat it. I mean, yes, the dice may tell me something different, but even in something like Q1, you're expected to go up against a demon lord, Lolth, and defeat her. If this was Call of Cthulhu, you wouldn't even get in the front door. You'd be dead already.
Right. So one of the things that you're pointing out is that without the agency in the horror sort of genre, it becomes more weighted toward that sort of progression through information, the mystery that we were talking about. And so I want to circle back
Sure.
because a lot of the talk that you have done in both of the two genres where you're, particularly, fond of are focus upon that mystery. Now, have you got any times, even gaming at the house, where you have taken one of those other sorts of approaches, like I talked about? Have you ever started with the idea of a title? Have you ever worked through one based on the idea of what the movement through the map is going to look like, without focusing on the mystery, or do you pretty much exclusively channel through the progress of information?
It I would have to say most of the time I work on what is the central mystery, what is the central theme, what is the central task, and work out from there. Other times here's a good example. Right now, I have a title and a basic idea for a time travel D&D adventure where I haven't done it yet with these kids, and in my own rules, I say you can do one time travel adventure in D&D per group. That's it. I know other people would have different things or never do it. For me, I allow myself one, and that's it. I'm about ready to try it, and I thought, all right, so what am I going to do? Don't know. I have the D&D characters. I think I'm going to bring them to the world, the highly futuristic world of 1986, because I just got done watching Stranger Things season 2, and I thought that would be fun. And I thought, well, what are some good modern games? Well, I've been playing a lot with the new Villains and Vigilantes that just came out, the Mighty Protectors. So I thought, well, converting between D&D and Villains and Vigilantes is actually pretty easy. So I can take their character sheets one day when they're not looking, create some Villains and Vigilantes characters, do a time travel adventure, and plop them there. I have that. I have a title, which comes from Teen Titans Go episode. It's called The Night Begins to Shine, which will make my kids laugh. And that's it. That's all I got.
And I didn't mean to suggest either
Yeah.
that because you're designing a mystery that it's exclusively that, or that you don't work in
Right.
the other factors of adventures. I'm focusing on initial steps, because I think when people are looking at adventure design, really most of the time they're looking at what are my initial steps, and then I'll sort of take it from there. And I've done a lot of writing, and tome of adventure design that sort of follows the whole progress through, and how to work in all of the different strands. But I think for the most part, people are really
it's right there.
How they start.
Yeah,
you've got to go.
Yeah, Tome of Adventure Guide is right there. So right next to the Glantry book.
Yeah,
and it's there. It's on the lower. Anything that's on the lower shelf usually gets pulled more often. So my son has actually been using that a lot lately. So yeah, I suppose for me, I end up with a lot of ideas for adventures, and some of them come to me sort of full cloth. The recent it was for Labyrinth Lord. It was the city of Dolomve, I believe it was. Let me see where it is. Yeah, Guidebook to the Duchy of Valmall, and it's a thick book, and I have an adventure in there, and it's called The Haunting of Oakcrest Manor. Haunting of Oakcrest Manor came to me pretty much entirely written in my head. I knew exactly what it was going to be about. I knew exactly what needed to be done by the players, and knew exactly what the end conditions were going to be to say the adventure was over. The only thing I was missing at that point were who are some of the interesting NPCs that they may run into. But everything else just sort of popped in exactly like that. And then I know I said I'd take 50 hours. I probably sat down and wrote the whole thing in 8 hours because it came so fully formed in my head. Other adventures, I haven't, quite worked all the details out yet.
So let me once again circle back to something that you said earlier and tie it to something that you said later. So your usual sort of pathway of development is through the progression of information, the mystery.
Right.
And you said that one of your techniques for doing it was to come up first with the large brainstorm outline and then to pare that down.
Yeah.
And so, and am I crossing videos? Was that this one? I've forgotten whether it was in this one or not. But
it's not in this. It's in the previous video, which everybody should watch anyway.
Okay, so yeah, so everybody, if you're at this point, you're screwed. But
that's right. You're in for a penny, in for a pound, right?
What you should have done was watch the other video first. But so you talked about beginning with the larger brainstorm outline, and then beginning to pare it down into something else. And so now, what I'm hearing is that your large brainstorm outline is going to be almost exclusively about information flow. And then you pare that down?
Sorry, you broke up there for just a second.
Oh, okay. So the large,
the larger, yeah,
the
everything
large
except
outline,
for the last word,
and then moving it down with the paring down process. Your larger outline starts focused almost exclusively, it sounds like, on the progression of information, or is that wrong?
No. The larger outline is, and actually, I end up calling it it's a thick outline is what I end up calling it.
Okay. Right.
Because it's an outline with, instead of sentences or bullet points, it's an outline with paragraphs, ideas. And then I spent a lot of time drawing arrows back and forth between plot elements. But the point being is, it is the information flow. Where do I suspect the characters are going to move? Not just in terms of where they're going to move, say, through an adventure, which would be fairly linear, but move through, or a physical space. But how am I expecting them to move through the information gathering? So in my adventure that I had been calling Indigo's a New Black, like I said, it actually has a new name. I just can't say it yet. The information flow, they have to go back to this. They have to go back to this guy who is telling them he's a demon lord. At least twice to get all the proper information. They have to go to this salt packing plant on a wharf twice to get full information. Once to get some information, and then again to find another body. So if that's the progression of the players, it looks like a lot of backtracking and going all over the place. But in terms of information flow, it's a pretty straight line. At least it's a straight line from my point of view. How they get there or what they do can kind of depend. And then that's the other thing. I'm trying to be very cognizant of railroading. For some reason, I have a very irrational fear that my adventures are going to feel railroady. And I think it's probably because where I got started, some things were railroady in the beginning.
Well, I think that's a rational fear when you are doing when you are designing an adventure based on the progression of information. I think there is the risk to simply write it to where they are forced to get those various things in the order that you originally planned, rather than in some sort of random agglomeration of putting things together, because you have to step back and then rethink the thing through in terms of the physical space, the tactical space, like you were talking about. Is almost a two-part design. One checks the other.
Right, exactly. And the one thing I've always learned from my days teaching undergrads is, if you've got a group of people, they're never, ever going to go the way you think they're going to go. So I could have this carefully planned out adventure where I like, okay, so the character's going to come in, they're going to start at point A, they can move to point B, and then from that point they can go to C, D, or E, and then my characters will come in, start at point A, and want to immediately go to J. I'm like, well, wait a second, you don't know enough to go to that bar yet. But I have to think to myself, well, maybe they want to go to that bar. What can they find out while they're there? I mean, yeah, there's some information they need there. I know this. They don't know that, but they suspect it. What happens when they do? Or the one thing that always sort of makes me groan a little internally, when my kids will say, we split up and search for clues. You know, pulling the Scooby-Doo thing, because they know that there's going to be always know there's going to be something of a mystery. They always know that if they split up, it's going to take 3 times longer. They do it to me on purpose, because they know that it'll make me laugh, and do everything. I'm like, all right, fine. I got to figure out now. I've got two separate tracks of investigators going on here. How do I bring these two together, and what do I think about what's happening? And I mean, it's easy if it's just like a dungeon crawl. Okay, fine. You go there, you go there. But at that point, and you fight monster A, you fight monster B. But at that point, we're not playing D&D so much as playing a much more expensive version of the dungeon board game. So,
Yeah,
which
I
we
can
still
see
we
that.
do enjoy. We do enjoy dungeon a lot. So,
Well, so and then one of the other things too is, and this is probably one of those things that really is just you fix anybody running an adventure is just going to fix stuff on the fly. But
right,
when I'm writing a published adventure, one of the things that I do when there is some sort of progression of clues, like I wrote one called Rogues in Ranbalo, which is there's a bunch of clue gathering that can give you some advantages when you ultimately go after the people who are in the spot, and you've got to find where that spot is too. But you along the way you pick this stuff up. When I'm writing one for publication, I do tend to go back with the assumption, because I think of it if here are little information nodes. I don't know
right.
if you do it the same way, but once I have tracked the first set of arrows through that, I do try and look and see whether what happens if they're at this place first. Is there? I try and have an outgoing arrow to somewhere else as well, where not only can you get here from a particular direction, but here's an area that you could get to sort of further back in the information tree that either verifies something that you already found out, or at least accommodates the fact that the adventurers almost certainly, like you said, will not be going through that track of information in the same way and in the same order that you assumed.
Yeah, what I do that. I do that as part of my design process a little bit, but knowing full well that I'm never going to think of everything. When I have the time, and I do this with game material, and I do this especially with adventures, I try to find somebody other than me to run it. So I'll run it once, and then I'll hand it to. I've got a good friend. He runs stuff for his kids as well. We've known each other for years. He's also an old school guy. I'll hand it to him, and I'll say, "Here, break this," and he'll run it for his kids, and then he'll come back and say, "All right, this is why this doesn't work." I'm like, "Okay, good." Or I'll hand it to my son, and I'll say, "Here, run this with your group, and let me know how it works." And if I can, when I can manage it, I try to say, "Here, I'll hand it to," let's say, for example, I'll hand it to Greg and say, "Hey, can you run this under old school D&D, Labyrinth Lord or something?" And then I'll hand it to my son and say, "Hey, can you run this under Dragon Age? And let me know how it works." And that way I sort of...
That's an interesting approach to the playtesting, to try it in different systems.
What I end up doing, and I did this a lot with Ghosts of Albion, because even when we were working on the rules, we didn't have all the rules, everything. So we were like, well, let's run this under Buffy, see how it works. And let's run this under Call of Cthulhu to see how it works. I hope that doesn't mean I owe Chaosium money now for this, but it's I always will try to run things under different systems because that helps me eliminate any system level issues. I don't run into those very often, but I had run into them enough to where it's something that I've done in the past, and it has served me very well. The large disadvantage, of course, is it takes me 3 times longer to get something done. I'm waiting for, a playtest report from one guy, and I'm waiting for another report from my son because he can't get his friends all together that weekend because they've got final exams. So he's not ready to run anything yet. And so I'm over here going, well, I think this is how it's going to work, but I want to be sure. I won't necessarily say I'm a perfectionist in that respect because I don't believe there's such a thing as necessarily a perfect adventure. There's perfect adventures for me. There are perfect adventures for other people, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're the same thing. I like to get them at least to a point where I'm very happy with them and like, all right, this is fun. And I think that's my largest design goal is this, if I write this, is this something I would want to buy and play? That's really the entire that's the entire philosophy of why I have so much stuff out there for the witch class, because I always wanted to play witches in my game. Nobody was doing them the way I liked. I'm like, fine, I'll do them myself.
Yeah,
And
yeah, and you do have a lot of witch material. That's
well, yeah, and I should probably open up one of the cabinets down here because the whole brainstorming outline thing. I have 30 years worth of notes in a binder that's probably about this thick, so it's probably close to 800 pages.
you know that's how Tome of Adventure Design got started, right?
Yeah,
All that
sure.
it is was my you know, reference pile of tables, because I'm one of those people where you come up with an idea and you're like, how did I come up with that? And I was like, well, what if this changed? And, you know,
Right.
you start putting in this change, this change, this change, you come out with a table. And so I had this huge stack of them, and that's how that got started.
Yeah, with me, it was like, okay, what do I want in a class? All right, I write it everything, and like I said, I have all this material, and I'm going to argue that 80% of it's never ever going to see the light of day because
Yeah. Yeah.
it's just not good. I'll be honest, it's not good, but that's fine because you know I can take that 20% and I can refine it down, and then maybe get instead of 800 pages, I have 40 pages that I really,
Yeah.
really like and I think is good. And I can put that out. And then maybe I can take another 20 pages and create something else, like one of the side effects or byproducts, I think is a better word, of all the writing I did on the witch over the year, you know, since the mid 80s, is I also have enough material for a decent healer class. And I have a ton of material for a necromancer. And maybe one day I'll, you know, do something with those. Don't know yet, but I got it because it was just part of the research process.
Yeah, it all bubbles up, and you never know exactly when
Yeah.
something's going to come up with. All right, Tim, with that, let's go ahead and close out this video, and we'll call this one a wrap. And I'll go
Excellent.
ahead and so say goodbye to all the folks.
All right,
And
everybody.
we'll
Thanks for
sign off.
watching.
Well, that's the wrap up on this conversation with Tim Brannan. So I'd just like to give the sign off line of no matter what kind of Dungeons and Dragons that it is you play, imagine the hell out of it.